Hello Algebra 2. Tonight's videos, there's two of them. Video 1 is going to have the learning target of I can factor out the greatest common factor, or GCF. Video 2 will be talking about the learning target of I can factor a general trinomial when a equals 1. Please pause the video and write in these two learning targets for day 2 notes. The first question we have is, how do I factor whole numbers? And the two ways that we remember from previous years in math are prime factorization or a factor tree. And if you remember back when you were given a whole number, and let's use the example of maybe 150. Remember, you would try to get 150, break down all of the numbers into 150 until you got them completely factored to prime. So when a number is completely factored, we're going to have prime numbers. So when we look at 150 and the word factor, remember we are going in the reverse of multiplying. We're breaking down that number into numbers that would multiply to it. And so the first thing I'm going to think about is what two numbers come to mind to me when I think of a 150. And to me, and you might have something else that comes to your mind, and there's no wrong answer of how to start as long as it multiplies to 150. So for me, I'm thinking of 15 times 10 is the first thing that comes to my mind. That would equal 150. And 15 and 10 are not prime, so I have to keep going all the way down until it's completely factored and I'm left with prime numbers. So 15, if I had to break that down further, the only two numbers I can think of are 5 times 3. And 5 and 3 are prime, so we've gone far enough for this side of the tree. And now we have to look at 10, and the two numbers that multiply to 10 would be 5 and 2. So I've completed the prime factorization, and I can check by multiplying all my numbers to check. So 5 times 3 times 5 times 2 should equal 150. So the way that we can determine if we factor correctly is to multiply to check. So if we look at this student's work and we want to determine if they factored correctly, we would multiply the answer to see if I got the original expression that they want us to factor. So go ahead and pause the video and multiply 5x cubed y times what's in the parentheses and see if you get question number 1. Okay, so remember, when you're multiplying two terms, you multiply the coefficients, the numbers in front. So 5 times 7 would be 35. And then you multiply the variables. And when you multiply the variables, you add exponents. So we have x cubed times, and there's no x here, so it would be x cubed. And then we have y times y cubed. And we're adding the exponent, so technically there is a 1 here, y to the 1. So we have y to the 4th, so we add 1 plus 3. Second step is to multiply 5x cubed y times negative 12x. So we have 5 times negative 12 would be negative 60. And then x cubed times x, again, there's a 1 here, so 3 plus 1 is x to the 4th. And last, our y to the first power, or y, there's no y here, so it's just y and then we check to see if it's the same, and it is. So yes, this is factored correctly. Okay, so our first factoring technique number 1, finding our greatest common factor, that's always the first step to any factor problem. So please highlight that, star that. This is going to save you a lot of work if you remember to always do this first. Okay, let's look at one example, and then I'll have one for you to try. In our first example here, we have numbers and we have variables, and when we're factoring out our greatest common factor, remember we're looking for what the greatest thing that they have in common. So if we're going to look at each thing separately, I'm going to look at the 8, the -2, and the 4 and see what they have in common, and then I'll look at all the x variables and then the y variables. So let's first start with 8 and -2. So if I was to do a factor tree of 8, I would have 4 times 2, and then 2 times 2 times 2 would equal 8, to have down to prime factorization. For -2, we have factors of -1 and 2, and then for 4, we have 2 times 2. Now to find the greatest common factor between these three numbers, we look at their prime factors that would multiply to them and see what they have in common. And we want to find the greatest thing they have in common. So we can see that an 8 has a 2, so does the -2, and so does the 4. Now this 4 has another 2, and so does the 8, but because the -2 does not have another common factor of 2, our greatest common factor between these three numbers would be 2. Okay, so that's our first step. Now we want to look at the variables, and remember what x to the 4th means. It equals, remember, x to the 4th means x written that many times of the exponent, so x times x times x times x. Here we have an x squared, so x squared would be equal to x times x, and x cubed would be equal to x times x times x. So what they have in common, they both have 1x, and they have another x. Again, the x squared doesn't have any factors left, so that this x squared would be what they all have in common. They don't have another x here, so this is our greatest common factor. So x times x, which would be x squared. We can do the same thing with y, where we have y squared, y and y cubed, and we'll see that what they have in common is a y. So the only thing that the greatest thing that they have in common, and the only thing, is a y. So they don't have anything else in common, so we have to stop there. Now to write down the greatest common factor, we have to include all three parts. So for our number, it is 2. For our x variable, it's x squared. And then for our y variable, it's y. So this is your greatest common factor. Now they want us to factor it out. So we factored out, and then we have to determine what goes in our parentheses. Now there's two ways to think about it. You can think about what times 2x squared y would be equal to 8x to the 4th y third, and fill in the blank. Or we can divide 8x to the fourth y cubed divided by 2x squared y. So either way, whichever method you like the best. I'll show both because some students like one over the other. So if I'm going to think about dividing my greatest common factor from this first term, then I remember you would look at the numbers first. So 8 divided by 2 would be 4. And then x to the fourth divided by x squared would be x squared, because remember you'd have x to the fourth would be 4 x's, x times x times x times x over x squared. So those would cancel and you'd be left with x squared. Last, you'd have y cubed divided by y, and that would result in y squared. Okay, so you multiply to check, make sure 4 times 2 is 8, x squared times x squared is x to the fourth, and then y squared times y would be y cubed. So the first term is correct. Now we have to do the second term, so we can do it the same way where we have negative 2x squared y divided by my 2x squared y. So if I have negative 2 divided by 2, that would be negative 1. And then x squared divided by x squared would be 1, and y divided by y would be 1. So our middle term is negative 1. And again, you always check, make sure negative 1 times 2x squared y would be negative 2x squared y. Our last term, we have 4x cubed y squared, and we factored out 2x squared y, so we can do the same thing. 4x cubed y squared divided by our 2x squared y, and we have 4 divided by 2, so that would be 2. And then x cubed divided by x squared, so remember that would be x times x times x divided by x times x. So these x's would cancel and those, we'd be left with x. And last, we have y squared divided by y. Again, y squared divided by y would end up with y. So we multiply to check. 2 times 2 is 4. X times x squared would be x cubed, and y times y is y squared. So there we finished. We factored out our greatest common factor, and it was 2x squared y, but our final answer is the entire answer that we've came up with. I want you to go ahead and try number 3 on your own and then bring it back, and I'll show you another way to do it. Okay, so you should have found that your greatest common factor was 3ab, because the greatest thing in common between 9 and 3 would be 3. And then between a cubed and a would be a. And between b and b squared would be b. So that's your greatest common factor. So we've divided that out, and now we have to fill in our blanks. So the second way to think about it is what times 3ab would be equal to 9a cubed b. So first you think of the number, what times 3 is 9, so that's 3. Then a to what power times a would be a cubed, and that would be a squared. And then we don't need any b's because 1 times b would be equal to this b. Lastly, we do the second one, and we think of the numbers. 1 times 3 is 3, so we don't need a number. And then a times 1 is a, but we do need a b. So b times b is b squared. So our greatest common factor is 3ab, And for us to factor it out, we'd have 3ab times 3a squared plus b.